schemes that they would retire on. That was my memory of entering the workplace. And obviously I didn't get those types of pensions. And then now as an employer, when I look at my team, after the enormous amount of money that goes out from their salaries on student loans, if they have anything left, I can see that it automatically goes into their pensions. But for that middle generation, my generation of Gen X, we started work too late for DB, and we started too late to be auto-enrolled in direct contribution schemes. And as a result, we are about, as a generation, we are about to experience a shock. And I think one of the reasons why that shock is waiting for us is partly because it's so hard to discover what your pension is. I tried to do this a couple of years ago when I started at the SMF, because I thought I should probably know what my pension is, given how much we work on it, how much I talk about it. And I've had 12 jobs. I couldn't find 2 of the pension pots at all. I don't have any pieces of paper or any emails. I had 2 emails from pension providers that I couldn't identify, and I thought that they must connect, but they didn't. Those 2 pension providers said they had no record of any pension that I ever had, and that it may be that they were acquired by other companies over time. So one of the barriers is how difficult it is to know what your pension pot is. Hopefully that gets solved in the next year or so by the introduction of the pensions dashboard. I think the other problem is people don't want to know what their pension is. And Gideon's done some fantastic work, and I think we'll see the detail on this. But there's a sort of looking through. It's a bit like watching a horror movie. You sort of don't really want to look at it full. You want to sort of hide behind the back of the sofa, look at it through closed fingers. And I think for lots of people, that's how they see their pension. And the idea that when they see their pension and what their actual income is in the dashboard in the coming years, it's going to be like going to the dentist after a very long time, and you're finally going to find out just how many cavities that need filling. And that experience is going to be a painful one, and we think it's going to be a significant one politically. So I think this is a really important piece of research. I think this gets to both the economics of the issue, but also the human issues behind that as well. And to kick us off, our chief economist, Gideon Salutin, is going to take us through the report.
No, thanks for coming. As Theo mentioned, we've been working on this for the last 6 months or so. The work was varied. We spoke to about 50 Gen Xers. We surveyed about 2,000 of them. We did your normal lit review and modeling, and most of the findings that you see come out of that. Overall, we found that 54% is the headline number. 54% of Gen Xers will face disappointing retirements. That's equal to 7.5 million people. Even more concerningly, 15% of these people have no way out. That's the term that we use. They do not have property that they can fall back on. They do not expect any kind of inheritance. They don't have investment or savings, and that's equal to 2 million people. Chris, who I spoke with in London, summed up the exact reason why he had been undersaving over the past 20 or 30 years.
It's always been one of those things that's been nagging in the back of my mind. But as I said, when the kids are younger and there's other financial pressures, it's probably the thing that went first, to be honest. And you sort of, at that age, 20s, 30s, you're sort of thinking that's a long time to worry about it. I'm sure it'll be fine, sort of thing. And as you get closer to that period, you kind of realise the clock's running down. And I don't think it changes anything, because I've been thinking about it already, but it just probably crystallises that there's going to be some lifestyle changes that we need to know.
That was emblematic of many of the conversations that we had. Gen X had a latent understanding that the retirement would not look rosy, but they put off looking into it, and similar to what Theo was describing earlier, and are yet to understand the full crystallized nature of what their pensions are going to look like. That 54% number that I mentioned comes off looking at 2 different ways to measure inadequacy. One is based on retirement living standards minimum levels provided by Pensions UK. That's an absolute measurement based on the amount needed to cover basic goods and services, currently at around 13,400 for a single person. TRR is another way. Target replacement rates vary based on someone's current income, and they're meant to maintain your current lifestyle in retirement. That often includes wealthy groups, I should add. Someone who is currently making, say, 100,000, putting away only 5,000 would fall below their target replacement rate, given the massive drop in living standards they could expect in retirement. We found that 39% are below their TRR, 35% are below RLS. A human being reading that would assume that the real estimate is somewhere in between those two. We found that, however, there's a fair amount that doesn't intersect at all. It's not that they're the same group, it's that they're two different ones, which puts the actual number at 54%, much higher than is usually quoted. How did we get here? Part of the reason, as Theo mentioned, was the shift from DB to DC pensions. Most people in Gen X who were on the front line of this change had seen their pensions, had seen their parents benefit from DB pensions, and had somewhat latently expected the same thing. They were only minorly aware of the change. They did not receive training and advice. And as they switched to DC, they were also not aware of what a hit they would take. 61% of DC holders are expected to be in a worse position by TRR as well as by RLS. Natasha, who I spoke with in the Southeast, was similarly unaware. She didn't even know, as she put it, she didn't even know what she didn't know.
What scares me is I read recently that you need at least to save at least £1 million to live comfortably in retirement. I don't know how people work out these figures. I don't know. I hear a lot about annuities. Do I think about the cost? I think about how much it would cost for us to live comfortably, and I think, I don't know, I think we'd need around 20,000 a year. I genuinely don't know. I don't know what that translates to in terms of having a pension pot. How much do I need in a pension pot to have 20,000 a year? That's what I'd like to know, things like that.
She was asked to handle it. She was given scant information, limited financial literacy, and she's representative of a great deal of Gen X who have underinvested since that shift from DB to DC. Auto enrollment definitely helped. There's no denying that. It was extremely useful, but as Theo mentioned, it came too late for many. While millennials and Gen Zers will see most of their working life covered by auto enrollment and therefore be forced to save, Gen X, it can be as low as 40%. Or less if they're in areas that are covered by auto enrollment. Inadequacy varies by region and by gender. Again, this depends on how you measure it. If you're looking at TRR, those most likely to fall below it are in the Southeast. That comes with those high incomes that you see. If you measure by RLS minimums, which correlate with poverty, you see it more in the North and in Wales. Same is true in terms of gender. Men are more likely to fall below TRR. Given higher incomes, women more likely to fall below RLS based on lower incomes. It's also a function of employment. The longer you take a break from employment for whatever reason, be it you were laid off, maternity leave, the more likely you are to fall below RLS living standards. 6 months without a job, you're at 30% of them are likely to fall below RLS standards. That's lower than the average. But as you go for 5 years, it looks more like 50%. And if you're out for 20 years, say for disability, it's 76%. In fact, we found that disabled Gen Xers are 5 times more likely to fall below RLS minimums than their non-disabled peers, controlling for different factors like housing and income. This has massive effects on politics. Ever quotable, Tony Blair said, your average Rottweiler on speed can be a lot more amiable than a pensioner wrong. We expect that to come up more and more over the coming years. Most Gen Xers have not really considered their pension yet. Most do not start looking at their pension until their 40s or their 50s or their 60s. Gen X is just getting to an age where they're going to start to worry about this. And that should be of concern to policymakers. At least 40% of Gen X voters in every major party are likely to experience pension shock. That's highest among reforms in the Greens, but the other major parties are not too far behind. And it's likely to accelerate. We found that for every £2,000 that a person falls below their target replacement rate, they're 1% more likely to consider pensions as a top voting priority. That came up in qualitative interviews as well. People would consider their pension for the first time. They consider the lifestyle changes that they would have to make. they'd realize they were already struggling to make ends meet, and then they'd be angry at the system. This was also true with Jeremy, who I spoke to in the West Midlands. He started the interview not knowing what to say, and the interview went well over time because we just had so much to talk about.
Basically, when I first said that, I was like, oh, what am I going to talk about pension? What am I going to, you know, what am I going to, what input am I going to have? And now I'm thinking about it, I'm like, well, I know nothing, but I'm also annoyed. I'm also annoyed now because I feel like I'm doing the right thing. You know what I mean? Like I've worked my whole life, I've paid in, I'm doing what, you know, waving the flag, I'm doing the whole, being a good citizen. And at the end of it, I'm just going to don't even get a gold watch. That was the old classic, wasn't it? Used to retire, everyone used to get a gold watch when they retired from the factory. Don't even get a gold watch. Just get 12 grand a year, kicked out the door.
We expect people frustrated like him to grow the more that people start thinking about the pension, they start talking about their pensions. There's a lot the industry can do to help, there's a lot the government can do to help, and I'm hoping that we can discuss it further. Thank you.
Thank you, Gideon. So I think, got a very clear sense of both the economic, political, and the human cost of. We come first to David Abraham, the chair of the Work and Pension Committee. I know you have to leave shortly as well, but I'd like to get your reaction to what you see here. You can sit here or jump up there, whichever you prefer.
I think. First of all, thank you so much. I found that absolutely a fantastic presentation, and reading the report was really very valuable in terms of the work of the select committee. So thank you for inviting me. Congratulations again. I have to say, given the work that the Work and Pensions Select Committee have been doing over the last 18 months or so, the findings aren't a surprise. We undertook a pensioner poverty inquiry and reported on that last year in the wake of the changes around the winter fuel allowance payment, and it revealed some surprising but also some worrying statistics. So, for example, we know that 1.2 million pensioners rely totally on their state pension, and it's about a third, just under a third, who rely heavily on the state pension. We know that there has been record undersaving for your pension over several years, but as I say, this report particularly highlights the importance of the Generation X and the next iteration of the crisis that we find. I also wanted to make people aware, many of you already will be, that there is in spite of what the narrative has been about pensioners, we do know that there is a slight uptick in terms of pensioner poverty in the last few years. So currently about 2 million, 1 in 6 are living in poverty. Much of this can be related to the cost of living crisis and the number of pensioners who are in private rented sector accommodation, energy costs, and so on. But there's also a point that I don't think was mentioned here, which was in terms of the failing health across the population. We're seeing it from our young people, but we're also seeing it from our older people. So in terms of your healthy life expectancy, that has been declining for a while, particularly in those areas where there's a high deprivation. And many people are then not able to work, to draw down any savings that they may have. I think the DWP estimated that the increase in health benefits accounted that 25% of that increase was as a result of the increase in state pension age and more people unable to work in later life. We're currently undertaking an inquiry called the Transition to the State Pension Age, which we're trying to understand in a bit more detail what might accommodate and ensure that people can work for as long as they're able, but what support can be made available. And obviously the Pension Commission is a really important commission. The terms of reference are specifically looking at adequacy, and we have tried to ensure that they look at adequacy in the context, not just the private pensions, occupational pensions, but also the state pension as well. I'll leave it there, but thank you so much again for inviting me, and I'll be here just before tea.
Next time we come to Catherine Foote, who's the director of the Standard Life Centre for the Future of Retirement, and very much an expert in this area, and also kind of sponsor of this report. I'd like to get your thoughts on how this would look.
Sure, thanks so much, Theo, and yeah, congratulations from me too. So it's a fantastic piece of work. Good morning, everybody. Lovely to see what a wonderful mixture of policymakers, voluntary sector activists, politicians, industry folk, historians, you name it, in the room today. And I think if this is a problem that is a complex one and not a straightforward one to solve, and it will take people from all of these different sorts of sectors working actively together to do what can be done. I often go back to an old piece of work done by the Latala team in DWP, the analysts in DWP, where they looked at a qualitative study looking at people's attitudes to workplace pensions. And it was Ipsos that did the work, and they summarised a complex piece of work in 3 words that I will never forget: detachment, fear, and complacency, as being the sort of articulation of people's attitudes to their workplace pensions. I think you can add now, with this work, 2 new words to that list, which are shame and blame. So detachment, fear, and complacency throughout that working life, and now shame and blame on realising what people are left with. I think this cultural shift that DC, the Gen X generation have experienced is absolutely at the heart of this. I sometimes liken it to being a digital native or not. Gen X are not DC pension natives. They didn't grow up in a DC environment, but they now find themselves having already worked for potentially a decade or 2 in that environment, not yet quite internalising that new reality for themselves. Believing that being in a scheme would be enough, they'd be broadly covered, got a decent job, maybe a better job than your parents, maybe a better educated than your parents, that you would be as well off as they would be in retirement, a reasonable kind of shorthand assumption. And also that your retirement income was maybe something that you didn't have a lot of control over. That could also be a bit of a cultural assumption, that you would have a relatively predictable and kind of given to you pension income, also something that's that I think comes as a shock. So the report itself, which I really urge you to look at, particularly, I mean, those videos are wonderful, aren't they? Absolutely fascinating. And the report itself is full of really interesting testimony from this generation in the qualitative work, as well as the analysis that's gone into the survey. But I think there are maybe three things I'd pull out in terms of areas for action, and then none of them are easy. So the first is that a whole lot of people, including some people in this room, need to take very, very seriously how we're going to tell them and how we're going to support them when they find out. And I think we should be honest that the pensions industry is not perfectly incentivized to want to do this brilliantly and want to spend all the money it can doing this brilliantly, and nor a government. So somewhere there's going to have to be some compelling going on, or some sort of some will here we need to find in the system to really think about how we go beyond just delivering the pensions dashboard as sort of technical product, but really think about those journeys to get people to it, to use it, to understand it, to take practical, kind of relatively frictionless action as a result, if they're able to. Second one I would say is that if you yourself find yourself in a situation that lots of people on those videos and in this work find themselves, you don't feel like you've suddenly got a chance to increase your pension contributions or magic up money from somewhere else, you're not expecting an inheritance or housing wealth down the track. Really, the main lever at your own personal disposal is to choose to work for longer. So I think there's a huge agenda here around how the government can support that. I'm a huge fan of the youth guarantee and the work that's been announced recently. There's clearly a real problem in youth unemployment in this country at the moment, but there are problems at both ends of the age spectrum of our labour market, and we need, I think, to see lots more investment in mid-career guidance for people, expanding that lifelong learning entitlement, widening access to employment services, and crucially providing lots more flexible and part-time work. We know that's something that that as people get into their 50s and 60s, that's what they're looking for and find so hard to find. I find it bewildering. Well, I don't really find it bewildering. I find it frustrating that businesses seem to persist in discriminating against workers in their 50s and 60s, as we know that some do in their recruitment algorithms and things. Because they're shooting themselves in the foot, aren't they? In a world where a third of our working age population is over 50, and this is the talent that's available. And then just thirdly and finally, I guess it's also really critical, and I would put this at all of these things at the feet to some extent of the Pension Commission, but this third one most definitely so. We need to make sure that the money that this generation do find themselves having isn't then kind of misused. People aren't making bad decisions with the income that they do find themselves able to access in retirement. So getting the right kind of support, the right products, the right default journeys with those retirement income that make for this generation to make sure that they're as protected as possible and able to be protected from the risk of making bad decisions. It is essentially, this is the little microcosm of not just a financial challenge for a generation, but a huge system transition challenge, isn't it? What we're seeing here, I think, the impending retirements of this Gen X generation who've missed out, as you've articulated both of you already, is essentially the coming home to roost of sort of a 20-year gap between realising the decline of GB and then that first pensions commission and its sort of creation of automatic enrolment coming fully into the economy. And clearly, I think, hopefully we can talk about this a little bit later, it's not doing something about this isn't just sort of sound, rational, sensible pension system policy making. It's clearly also quite imperative and important good politics for anybody wanting to get elected in the future. Perhaps you can talk about that a bit later on. Thank you.
Thanks, Catherine. Yeah, and I think that first point on the incentives as they exist or don't exist for the industry, but I think particularly if you're number 10 or the Treasury and you've got you're facing the forces of populism, the idea that you're going to go out and tell people actually it's even worse than you think and let us explain how, you can see why they're sort of disincentivized from doing that. But people are going to find that out, both when they get the letters from their pension holders when they reach 55, but also in their dashboards in the next year. So that's why we think it's a shock, because if people aren't brought into this, help to understand it, it's going to come suddenly. Debbie, I know you want to leave, so thanks very much. Next, I'm going to come to Zoe Alexander, who is the Director of Policy and Advocacy at Pension UK. Zoe, what do you think can be done? How can we support Gen X? Sorry, what do you think should be done during this to help?
So first of all, congratulations on the report. I found it really fascinating. It's particularly kind of visceral read for me, being part of Gen X, and I was reflecting with some others over coffee how little gets said about this generation. Actually, it is a bit of a skip generation in terms of some of the research, and it felt very, very, very familiar to me reading through some of those verbatims and some of the attitudinal research around this piece. The graph that I found the most interesting in the piece was on page 53, which was the graph that answered the question, who or what do you think is responsible for the size of your private pension? And it's striking that half of the people answering that said me, right? And that's consistent with a lot of the research that we've done quite recently this year. So this real sense of sort of, I should be saving more, I should be doing something about this, but I'm really not quite sure what. And then a third of people said government. So you've got this kind of heady mix, and it speaks to Catherine's point about shame on the kind of consumer, I should do something, and blame on the kind of, hang on, I've had something done to me by government and it's not quite right and it hasn't given me the thing that I thought it would give me. So I thought that was really, really interesting. And only 14% in the vulnerable group said employers, right? And take 50 years ago, they'd have all said employers, and employers are so far down. And that reflects the fact that if you're on a relatively low wage, on average, you're more likely to be working for an employer who isn't putting extra in, who isn't telling you very much, if anything, about your pension, who's doing the minimum to comply. So what can be done? You know, I sort of hesitate to say 12% contributions, please, but I have to keep saying it. It's very interesting easy for the industry to keep saying it, and I think it's become a bit of a trope, and I'm very conscious of that. But you know, academics are saying it, unions are saying it, consumer groups are saying it, everyone is saying it. It's long-term policy making. It's really, really hard to do, but we have to do it now. We've got a pensions commission. We cannot miss this boat to push contributions up further. We're storing up trouble, if not for Gen X, because it might be too late for some of them, for the next generation, the next generation after that. We're just anchoring at the wrong point, so I would do that. There might be some flexibility you want to build in for the very lowest persistent earners, and we're doing some research at Pensions UK to think about what that might look like this year, so that will be coming out in a couple of months' time. I think the value of the state pension is incredibly important. The triple lock we would like to see abide for a while to bring more people out of poverty. We'd also like the Pensions Commission, actually, although I know it's not within their remit, to come out and say what good looks like for first pillar provision in this country. What are we trying to head for? The RLS is a really good benchmark. We don't actually expect the RLS to be the thing that the state pension is anchored to. It's intended as a yardstick to assess affordability and living standards as opposed to a technical policy measure. But it's a really, really useful way of saying how are people living, how are they being enabled to live, and is this good enough? Actually, let's ask ourselves if it's good enough. So we would really support keeping the triple lock in place until we've got to that level, whatever that level is, and then probably move to another form of indexation. And then on the kind of telling people point, so interesting, isn't it? And I see Richard in the audience, I'm sure, thinking about the dashboard and whether that's in the next year or the next year or two. I'm really interested in AI and in how people are going to be told about this stuff, because I question, if you given how fast things are going to be moving, 2 years' time, are people going to be logging onto the MAPS dashboard? Some people will, but a lot of people will be talking to Alexa or their chatbot and saying, what's my retirement income going to be? How can we make sure, and it's a really difficult question, and I definitely don't have the answer to this, but how do we make sure that when they ask that question of their chatbot, they get the right information? The RLS shows up. I'd love that, the retirement living standards show up alongside it as part of the next question. Can I show you how this relates to what the standard of living is going to be like in retirement, and how can we wrap some guidance around that? Because I think building in physical guidance appointments is great, and we'd really support that. But I personally think this generation of Gen Xers, and certainly the new ones and the Gen Zs that follow, are looking to a chatbot for this information, and that's where we need to be focusing energy and attention.
Yes, thanks, Emily. Yeah, there's a couple of things that struck me there. The skip generation, when we were considering whether or not we should call this, describe this as Gen X, one of the things I was saying is I don't think Gen X think of themselves as Gen X. I think we've had various names in TV generation at one point, I think. And then my team said, but there was no one important in Gen X. Who are Gen X? And then we went through, actually, yeah, there's none of the leaders of the political parties are actually in Gen X. They're all just too old or just too young. But I did have to explain, yes, we are important. We do have significant jobs to my team. The other thing I think you're absolutely right around AI. And we did a piece of work with PIMFA recently as well, where we're looking at how people are using AI for retail investment advice. One of the things that we think might be possible is for Treasury DWP to sort of build their own AI chatbot using information that can be absolutely relied upon as being accurate. They could build it using other models, but making sure that when people want to type in that sort of information, that the information they're getting is not 3 years ago because ChatGPT scraped the wrong piece of data, but actually something that's provably verified by government at the right time, because they are going to use those tools. And if we don't provide them the right ones, they'll end up using the wrong ones. Last but not least, I want to come to Baroness Susan Kramer, who's a Liberal Democrats Lord spokesperson for Treasury Economy, and a long-time friend of the SNF. Love to hear what you think about the report.
Well, first of all, congratulations on basically an Emperor Has No Clothes report, which I think was absolutely essential. I have just 3 minutes in which to speak, so there's sort of three things that I want to speak to. And I'm a legislator. This first comment is to the government and to Parliament. And it seems to me it ought to be observing in this area the principle of first do no harm. And we've had legislation coming through which positively does harm. I've just been working on the National Insurance Contributions Salary Sacrifice Bill. This is the one that puts a £2,000 cap that's on NICS relief, on salary sacrifice eligible for NICS relief. The government says this is, to deal with rich people who are abusing the system. I got some numbers from the House of Commons library, and one of the biggest groups impacted is the second decile. And that's going to be very often this appropriate generation. It's young people, they've started to work, they don't yet have the mortgage and the kids, and they've been putting away a significant amount of money for pensions. And now an incentive and a nudge that's really significant is being removed. And I don't think the government has the faintest clue what that impact is. And then if you look at the lifestyle pattern, people then stop saving once the mortgage and the kids are there with all of their priorities. And then they end up trying to catch up at the very end of life. And I don't think we look at those lifestyle patterns, certainly not in legislation. So the changes in inheritance tax rules for pension pots, people would say, oh, that doesn't affect, younger generations. They all have grandmas like me who were going, we were so stupid as to put into a pension pot the money we thought was there in case we needed a care home and otherwise would go to the kids. The negative impact of this stuff, again, IHT, reductions in relief on small businesses and farms. I think the government has got to, if it wants to get people to say that it's got to start aligning what it does in various areas of taxation and policy with that principle and with that direction. I am one of those people, if I look at something different now, sort of being captured under the Pension Schemes Bill, that I'm concerned about the Mansion House Accords. I take a basic view, which is pensions are overwhelmingly in order to provide for the pensioners, not a pot to promote the economy. I understand you want to promote the economy and all of that is good, but I'm very concerned about the change in balance that the Mansion House Accords introduces. And very specifically, the Mansion House Accords, which require 10% of auto-enrollment default funds to be put into high-risk illiquid assets, is targeting, it shows no comprehension of risk. You're looking at a group of people, auto-enrollment default funds, by definition, people with the lowest incomes and the least financial knowledge. And without consent, 10% of their pension pot is going into that high-risk illiquid assets, venture capital, 75% of the investments of venture capital fail. So look at infrastructure, think HS2, the Elizabeth Line, Hinkley Point, and often a series of disasters. It's very high-risk stuff. And the notion that the government has that, in fact, you can find high-return, low-risk investments just with a little wisdom, I think is frankly for the birds, so that really worries me. And finally, I wanted to talk to the role of the state pension. Because I think there is pressure against the triple lock, and I'm very resistant to it. And it's for this reason, because it's often seen as an intergenerational battle. But the concept behind the triple lock was basically, I think, to say for people on average earnings, when you retire, your expenses go down by roughly a third. The state pension needs to be built up to the point, and the triple lock has been the mechanism, it's not yet there, to then be about a third. And that leaves you in your own private capacity to find a way to put aside enough to give you the remaining third. Or if you want a bigger lifestyle than that, then obviously that's a bigger number. But I think that interlocking role of dropping your expenses, that's pillar one, as Zoe was describing it, and your own savings is never carefully explained to people, but it is absolutely crucial that we get that understanding right.
Thank you. Yeah, I think on the triple lock, that this piece of research has actually changed our view. We've always previously felt that the triple lock is unsustainable and been advocating to come off it sooner, which you may disagree with. But actually, this report made us feel like it can't be done until this age group gets past this
Yes.
trough.
That has always been the notion that it's a mechanism to get to the right point, at which point you stop, and it just goes up by inflation.
Yeah, and I think it would be good to set out what that point is, and Gideon can perhaps come on to that as well. I'm going to come to the audience who've waited patiently, I'm sure, to ask questions. So if you put your hand up, we'll come to you. There's no microphone, so you're just going to have to talk loudly and clearly and briefly. I'll start with the lady. Yeah. If you could say yes, that'd be great.
I just wanted to ask you a little bit more about about the expectations for standard of life amongst Gen X, and so perhaps probing a little bit more on this language of shock, because it seems to me that actually the last 15 years and the period since the financial crisis have been extremely educative for the general public in terms of how the political economy of age has shifted. And it would be a big historical discontinuity if retirement incomes begin to drop, as it looks as though they will in the next few decades, given that every retiring cohort since the Second World War has retired with a greater degree of material security than their parents. But my sense is that Gen X kind of know this. So I wonder whether you can say a little bit more about this question of expectations, and whether there's a sense in which actually Gen X perhaps will be resigned to having a lower standard of living, what that might mean for politics.
Yeah, I was speaking with my colleague James Noyes on this, who's working a lot on Gen X. And he mentioned that there does seem to be a moment in every Gen X's life where they realized that the system wasn't working for them the way that they had been promised when they were a kid. Almost everyone that I spoke to in this, and it came through in the surveys as well, have minimal or moderate expectations for their retirement. Almost no one answered that they wanted what Pensions UK would call a comfortable lifestyle. They would say things like, I want to be able to take my kids out for ice cream. I might want 1 or 2 holidays a year, that sort of thing. Nonetheless, we found that over a third are likely to have a retirement much lower than what they described. We used Pensions UK's RLS standards for that. We compared how many people would fall into a tranche lower than they'd expected. I agree that there does seem to be a bit of a contradiction there. The report makes a distinction between those who expressed being surprised, very few expressed surprise, and there was no difference between the vulnerable and the secure households, but many did experience disappointment. And that it feels a little contradictory until you realize that what the first video spoke to, which is that there is a latent expectation that retirement won't be all right for them, but none of them have looked into it too closely. Theo mentioned staring at your pension with your fingers over your eyes. There is disappointment there, right? It's not that they are surprised. What they would express to me in our conversations is regret, shame, blame. But there was no sort of, stand up and shout moment. But that's not to say that it wasn't disappointing.
Yeah, there's a difference between knowing that you haven't been to the dentist in a long time and knowing that you've got to go and see the dentist and then seeing the dentist. Yeah, there was a question here.
Thanks, Theo. Stephen Lowe, Gen X, I'm a long-time researcher of Gen X. 2 questions, if I may, very quickly. One for you, Gideon, it's a numbers question. When I think about the retirement challenge, I always try and think about the household balance sheet. So there's a whole range of assets beyond pensions that help fund retirement. So I was going to ask you, to what extent have you been able to look at the household balance sheet as a way to narrow that financial challenge? Housing, ISAs, pensions, they're all quite mixed. And then secondly, maybe for Zoe and Catherine, you've both been researching this for decades. Was there any new insight in this that made you turn your head? Thank you.
Answer the first question. Yeah, we looked at that quite a bit. Firstly, we found that of that 54%, we looked at how many people had savings and investments, housing equity, or inheritance. We found that those accounted for about 10% each. The report will have the specific numbers, but it's around there. That left that 15% figure who had no alternative and were expecting. In terms of the investment question, bear in mind that this goes back to Gen X's original belief that the system would support them as it did their parents. We see much lower rates of investment from them, much lower rates of savings, much less in intensity with which they view their finances. So for a long time, they were tuned out, which is another reason.
Yeah, a couple of things I'd bring out, not but things that kind of affirmed it in sort of more detail assumptions that I had. So one is around the political impact. So, you know, that sense of, you know, anger at the government and where that might take you. I thought that was a really, really interesting perspective, and I haven't seen it called out in a research report in that report. So, and I think that's something that people need to be very alive to and think through really carefully. The other one was around this kind of sense of people feeling it's on them, which we know about, but it because it links to the research that we're doing at Pensions UK and it's a similar message. I think it's really, really interesting, and the kind of, although people are in a research environment, and I don't know enough about the environment to tell, but kind of you would say you want to save more in that research environment up to a certain point. You know, they are saying they want to do more. They like the idea of 12%. All of those factors. I think it's adding to that body of research, and I think that's really useful. Yeah.
Great. I mean, I agree. I think beyond that, I think what the report adds for me, and I haven't seen it done anywhere else, is a really, it's to your question in a way, Helen, a really thoughtful exploration of what going to the dentist is actually like, what confronting the reality is actually like, and the mix of immediate reactions after 2 minutes of conversation, 5 minutes of conversation, after some data is presented. I think the quality of insight there should be absolute gold for anybody interested in thinking about how to provide pension information, how to support people on their journey to thinking about what actions they need to take. It gets you to a level, I think, of subtlety, of humanity, of reality about that experience that takes us so far away from kind of, you know, hello, Mr. So-and-so, please nominate your retirement age, and here's your little diagram of an estimated retirement. So I think that broadly is for me what's particularly.
Susan, maybe I can follow that up with a question for you, which is, do you think the political parties are taking this issue seriously? Do you think they understand the risk? Do you think they're taking the right steps?
I think this is unfortunately one of those long-term issues, and I think at the moment we're in almost like crisis management mode. But I mean, the issue that has been raised, you know, what happens when there are disappointed expectations? We're getting that message at the moment. Politics over the last decade has been shaped by people who've become utterly frustrated, are disappointed. And, you know, very often government says, well, you know, we put more money into this, we put more money into that, and whatever else. They're not living the life that they expected to be able to live, and that they think they ought to be able to live in the 6th richest country on the globe. I think most of us in politics just know that this is a dangerous territory in which to get entailed in a conversation, because every other political party will use what you say against you.
Thank you. Yes, lady here.
Thank you. Finance advisor. Looking at this and thinking about making the high-risk investment, I would like to look at this about actually exercise. Even people who have put some money in the fold and save, they are facing a number of risks that will materialize in the next 5 to 10 years, we are talking about strategic assets, we are talking about climate risk, all of these. Now we feel that there will be a huge impact in what returns we're going to get when we retire, what money will be left in the pot. So I would like to ask your thoughts, how, in terms of the next steps, how the custodians of our pots of money are behaving and are taking into account whether they are and where the government and others actually can help us address some of those risks that also will affect our pots.
Anyone want to take that question on how people that hold our pensions and also the government anticipating some of those broader risks around things like climate change and
Yeah, I'm happy to have a go. I mean, I think, obviously the DC pension model involves people taking investment risk, and, I completely hear Baroness Kramer's concerns around the mandation clause and perhaps, even the Mansion House support that underpins it. Schemes in general are up for a level of those kinds of investments on the DC side, and they're thinking hard about ESG risks and hedging and how to manage some of those really fundamental investment risks. I think part of this is to do with glide paths and how you de-risk as you approach retirement, and then also towards the back end of retirement journeys, thinking about risk sharing models. So lots of schemes, as they're designing their accumulation journeys for retirement journeys, they're thinking about how can they pool risk with deferred annuitisation and that kind of thing, so taking people out of those riskier assets as they approach retirement. There's also obviously the CDC model, which pools risk all the way through. So we're interested in seeing how that fares. So, it's about, I think it's about looking at a multiplicity of ways of helping people to manage those risks, but they're very real. I'm not sure if that answers your question or not.
I think maybe as down to that, even the Bank of England has said that actually the way that risk is calculated in that, as you said, risk, risk is actually not fully understood. And that's why I'm asking how the government and how we see, obviously you have been in this field for so long, how do you see this new knowledge about the risks we are facing taken, embedded in the decision before it's too late, or in a way that actually, as you said, we know what is the de-risk investment that we should go to when we are approaching our retirement.
Gideon, did investment, sorry, I was just going on, Gideon, did investment come up much? And the role of stock market and trends in people's returns come up much in it?
Almost no. People were.
So it's sort of lack of awareness of that.
It's more a lack of awareness.
I was going to say, I think the government is trying to say we need to improve the standard of performance of the companies that hold your pension money. But they're doing this by basically saying the answer is size. We need to be enormous. I think there are a lot of questions around that, because you certainly don't get innovation out of enormous. And I just wonder if they're over egging the assumptions that they can make. You need high quality trustees, and I think trying to work out how you really can reinforce the skill base for those trustees and advisory work. It may be sometimes the elements of size. There's a piece of work that you can do around, I think, all of that. I am quite afraid once sort of the Treasury starts eyeing pension pots as that's a pot to achieve other goals, as I say, other than the best return for the people who are holding those pensions. I think picking back up on an earlier point that Thea was making, which is that this is politically dangerous territory, because once you start talking, so you can guarantee you will be holding your shield up as all the attacks come in. So this really is one of those areas where we need to find a way to be cross-party. In our discussions, it seems to me this is something that shouldn't be about ideology. So this is something where there needs to be real cooperation, because what you put in place has got to really work well for the long term. At the moment, in our fervent times, it's very hard to achieve that. But can I say public pressure basically pushing behind that, get yourselves together and let's get something worked out that can achieve what we need would be exceedingly helpful.
Catherine, you want to come back in?
Yeah, I'm delighted to hear that, Stephen. One of the other pieces of work that we're doing at the moment at the Standard Life Centre for the Future of Retirement is a scoping exercise about the prospect of citizen deliberation, public deliberation in this next phase of pension reform. I last did some big citizen deliberation on our pension system about the state pension, and these things take a long time to plan. And it just so happened that when we were holding the events, we did one in London and one in Birmingham, they just happened to coincide with Liz Truss's mini budget, and it was the most wonderfully cathartic place to be, because they were rooms full of thoughtful grown-ups, really engaging in subtle trade-offs respectfully with one another and debating the pros and cons of the right balance of responsibility and rights in the system, and who should pay for what and when. People of different generations, different sources of wealth. It was the most for me the most powerful indication that citizens can engage in these complex situations and these complex policy trade-offs with tremendous thoughtfulness and tremendous mutual respect and tremendous clarity when they're well supported. So we'll certainly be doing some work this year proposing that either through the pension commission process itself or maybe afterwards the DWP, there is a kind of a huge technocratic value in engaging the citizens, but also maybe a democratic and sort of politically protective value in doing some citizen deliberation into how we solve.
I think we've got time for two last questions. So there was one there and one here. We'll take both at the same time.
I'm joined Susan from the Financial Inclusion Commission. I also working with Catherine's other providers in the pensions. I was made a really good point actually about our saving trustees. But we have a huge focus on improving financial inclusion. We're actually arguing to improve the financial capability of consumers of all ages to meet the challenges of the risk transfer or the rebalancing risk figure to City wants to describe it. There is enough that consumers are facing with, and what's going to be a very rocky pensions journey through the because they are going to be employed, they're going to be self-employed, which is a lot actually. We need to bring self-employed into the group. If we don't use this, it'll be an afterthought. As much in pension discussion as actually the stuff that Nathan's talking about, actually, which they as well. So these are some of the issues that we tackle. And I think there's a big role for pension providers to become new platforms. If going beyond target support, but they're effectively now supposed to be more than just talking about pension accumulation. It should be on instincts. Financial capability to inform decisions. I think all of you in this pensions, there are big roles to play in that regard. But let me also put my hat on this education Education Association, because we have too many people dropping out nowadays. We need, even regardless of who these partners, we vote to keep people in work and get them back into work. If we keep them in work and keep them in pension, we get them back into work. We get them back into the pensions. So please, this conversation. Thanks.
Florence Ferdinand, self-employed millennial. So, you mentioned about treasury and what's money and hybrid investments, and I opened up the panel about how aware are the pension funds who engage with about the actual power that they have to shape the world that people Gen X now we're all going to be living in. And I think specifically about climate change and innovation, to your question, costs of heating, will we need air conditioning, costs of energy, but also the size of our economy. If we're thinking about Anthropic, ChatGPT, NVIDIA, all these gigantic behemoths, this concentration of wealth that is in America, which has come from pension funds investing in venture capital. we're getting left behind. Where is the sentiment there?
Great. So some lots of things to cover there. I think there's questions about financial inclusion, financial literacy, self-employed, which is something where we've done some work with Monzo, looking at how do you nudge and encourage more self-employed pension savings, but we know it's a huge problem. And then I think this question of sort of the future economy and what that looks like, what does that mean for our pensions? And I think some trends we're seeing with AI already are that more value is only going to go to capital, and that capital is mostly in the US rather than to income and wages. And what does that mean for the long term of the economy and pensions? So a lot there. I'll ask the panel to respond to some of those questions and do their final summing up. Catherine, maybe I start with you.
Sure, thank you very much. Again, lots to say. I won't be able to respond to everything. I think when it comes to individual engagement, because I think one of the things that we've been talking about a lot today is this question of sort of the wake up moment, the moment of realization, the moment of individual engagement. I think we're going to have to realistically think about all sorts of different ways in which the light bulb moment can happen for people. I think there's, if you're talking about individual savers and their knowledge of their funds and what their own situation. So I think there is some evidence that for some people, a sense of the role that their pension can play in society, the role that their money can be, how their money can sort of be put to work in for the people of Britain, for the planet, is sort of motivating, engaging. I think there are others who are more immediately engaged by really very kind of pensions as financial capability. To Johnny's point, sort of some basic sort of rules of the game, some facts that people are very in the pensions industry are very passionate about sharing, and seem perennially frustrated that they can't quite get everybody to understand their 5 favourite facts about the pension system. And then I think there's another really interesting angle around how do you activate somebody's sort of future orientation? How do you make them care? How do you make them want to seek out this information? How do you make them want to take their hands away? I think we're going to need to be pursuing strategies across all of those fronts at once to support this generation effectively.
Great. Zoe, I'll come to you.
Yeah, happy to pick up the one about VC. So, you know, there is genuine interest in VC from particularly the big scale schemes, particularly those that are building in-house investment portfolios, but at the margins, right, they're looking for very small amounts of VC, and that's because of the risk and it's because of the fees. And it's not because they don't understand the bigger payoffs. There's a big debate going on about fiduciary duty and people seeing things in the round. There's the Evershed's opinion on the cushion investments. There's lots going on and lots being discussed. But fundamentally, these are people's hard and they can't the levels of risk associated with some of those types of assets, and they're not going to unless they're forced to, right? Which comes back to this mandation point and the absolute criticality of it not these pots not being used for political football. And I think, you know, this report reinforces the extent that, you know, for lots of this generation, the DC pot is going to provide a tiny sliver of income that's going to sit above the state pension, that's going to mean that they can go on one holiday or run a car or have pets. But those things are really, really important, and so we cannot take more risk with that money than we ethically should. It's a moral point.
I come to some of your points on upskilling. A lot of the recommendations that we have in here is about improving the financial awareness among people. The one area that I could confidently say 100% of people that we interviewed brought up is educating their kids on financial awareness. They brought it up unprompted, and they were all extremely interested in avoiding this happening to a future generation, the way they have been trapped in. So we've recommended that. In terms of educating older people, we've recommended a financial MOT that would allow anyone to, upon starting a new job, to access free, expert, independent advice that is publicly funded, so that they could get advice specific to their financial situation. And the last is getting comms right. While I was interviewing people, I mean, they were searching through troves of letters trying to find information. Theo is probably in the top 0.1% of the country in terms of pension engagement and awareness, and he can't find 2 of his pensions. This is a problem, right? And for a industry with near limitless amounts of money, the fact that they haven't improved consumer relations is a real problem going forward.
Susan.
Well, first, let's make sure this report gets distributed to everyone across the street. Could I just pick up the 2 last questions that came in? Because I think in a strange way, they both speak to the same issue, which is I think we have some fundamental structural problems, which we keep trying to address, but without the energy and perhaps with the open-eyedness that we need to. Financial inclusion is absolutely basic. You're not going to solve any of these problems unless you manage to tackle the whole issue of financial inclusion. And we tried it with fintechs, challenger banks, nothing of that works. The conventional banking system doesn't have an interest. I think we're missing a layer. That's, in my view, a sort of community banking that would deal with this, as well as lending to small businesses and whatever else. I think we have a structural problem. We're going to have to confront it, and it's going to require government interventions. Regulators don't fill market failure, and we've got a market failure. But I think the market failure also applies to the venture capital area in one sense, in that actually it's not difficult in the UK to start a business, even an exciting business. It's not easy, difficult to find first stage venture capital. It's when you start to scale up, and that's when you're moving away from the venture capital market into something that is more conventional. Well, you try and get our institutions to do that rather than put money into mortgages. That's a good luck to you. I think we are missing pieces within our structure, and those are market failures that government is going to have to address. Until now, it's always basically said that's the regulator's job, and the regulator turns around and says, I don't deal with market failure. I regulate what's out there. I don't spend my time trying to fill gaps. So we're going to have to work our way through that. In the States, interestingly, the regulators do focus on market failure. It's one of their key missions. So I think, you know, there's a lot of rethinking to do, but I think we need to accept that there are structural problems that we have to fix, hopefully in parallel. If we wait till we fix the structure before we do anything else, you know, we could all be in our graves, but that's one of the areas we must tackle.
Thank you. Thanks to all our panel. Thanks to Standard Life Centre for the Future of Talent for sponsoring the work. Thanks to the research team and Gideon for an excellent report. Thanks to our events team for a great event today. And if I can make one last plug before you leave, which is we have an email we send out every Monday, which is called Wonk Week. If you scan that, you can subscribe to it. It's completely free. Think of it as sort of like your 5 a day, but sort of, you know, it's the intellectual fiber you need to consume once a week. We read all of the think tank reports so that you don't have to, and then we summarize them very briefly, and then you can pretend that you're incredibly clever and break them all. And it's a very useful email. So it's subscribed to by thousands of people in Westminster and Whitehall, and you can do that just there. So thank you all for coming. Thanks for great questions, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.